So part one that I'm going to talk about is actually talking about relationships. So this is partly important, obviously, for you in your personal lives, but it's also important for you as a doctor who's going to be looking after patients coming into your consulting room. And quite often especially if you're taking a good, one of those nice biopsychosocial context interviews, you will discover that there's lots of relationship issues that actually has a massive effect on people's lives. And being able to, quite often patients will look up to you as the person that needs to be able to advise on that. So I've been asked before in terms of how do you help a relationship, or what is the top tips for a good relationship? And this is where I've realized that it's important to actually understand the science of getting along. So if we were to teach diabetes and you wanted to know how to explain to a patient, for example, how to use their insulin, you will explain to the patient a little bit about the pancreas and how insulin the body. Oh, is that slight echo? Can I continue? Yes, okay. So the secret to the magic relationship, then I'm just going to check who needs, I think someone needs to be muted. Alma, maybe you can help with that. Just keep an eye. If people log in, sometimes they don't mute automatically.
Yeah, I have muted. Okay.
Very cool. So what we're going to be covering now, and I have no apologies for spending quite a bit of time on this, is being able to understand why are the people we love the ones that we hurt the most. And it's one of those, I mean, if you look at the world in large, we all can see things like the conflicts in Gaza and these kinds of places, but actually most of the suffering that happens in our human lives actually happens with those that are closest to us. And being able to understand what happens in relationships and why we behave like that gives us the possibility to potentially behave differently. And this makes a difference in your relationship with your patients, in your relationships with your colleagues, in your relationships in your personal lives, in your relationships with your managers. And for me, this is part of our development as human beings, is being able to understand how this works. So I teach something called the neuroscience of emotional competence. And we're going to be looking at why people, and sometimes even maybe yourself, can be such a pain in the ass. And there's actually an amazing field that's opened up around what they call affective neuroscience, and being able to understand how the emotions work in the brain. So one of the things that I think we forget, and we actually do all know, is that every single one of you, as you go through your day, every single day, are in one of two major modes. The one mode is what I'm going to call survival mode. And when you're on survival mode, your limbic brain is actually in charge. You guys remember that central part of the brain with the limbic brain and the amygdala. And your sympathetic nervous system is in predominance. When I'm talking about creative mode, what happens is when this survival mode is quiet, your prefrontal cortex actually takes the lead and your parasympathetic nervous system comes into play. And there's, of course, a switch between these two, and that switch is adrenaline. And we are so used to switching between these two modes throughout our day that we're not always even aware on which particular level we are operating, but they're actually very, very different. And the thing that's going to trigger that switch is going to be any threat. So this can be a physical threat to your safety, for your physical safety, like if you're getting mugged or you're almost in an accident on the highway. It can be an emotional threat. So if somebody is horrible to you or rejects you or abandons you, or it can be somebody who is prohibiting you from being able to express who you are and is either discriminating against you or marginalizing you. So as we grow, as children, we inherit these two different systems. I'm not going to talk about childhood today, but as we become until we have raised some young and,
Your sound is coming and going. I don't know if the others can hear.
when we on. Sorry, Alma.
I couldn't hear for a bit. Could other colleagues hear?
We could
Might
hear,
be
Prof.
my...
Okay,
Oh.
all right.
Shame. Okay, but yeah, do interrupt. I'm just going to talk, just to mention again the survival brain. So our survival brain is that basic part of our cells that needs to avoid pain. And it's got these drives. So all our drives for things like resources, so food being a major thing, but money would also be part of that drive because it keeps us safe. Security, so making sure you've got a safe place to sleep at night, for example. Troop is your friendship circle, your family, your people, your person, those that that you surround yourself with. Power is important to the survival brain because the more power you have in a hierarchy, the more likely you are to survive. And of course, sex. And with sex, I don't just mean here the actual physical act of sex. I mean the whole thing about meeting a person, somebody you team up with and whom you might raise children with. So of course, raising children is no longer a priority in our society of today in terms of perpetuation of the species, but that drive to find somebody and meet somebody and connect with somebody is still built into us. And then if we're not in either of those two, then if we're in survival brain mode, we also have this energy preservation mode. And you all have that, you know, that those I can't be asked or I really don't feel like it mode. And that belongs part of that. And if you think of your puppy at home or your favorite animal at home, you will see those three modes very powerfully in play. But human beings is a little bit more sophisticated than just the animal part of ourselves. And therefore, I'm going to call the survival brain, and I want to imagine that it's this beautiful, powerful, but slightly stupid dragon that you have inside of you. And that dragon is comprising of your whole limbic brain, your muscle system, your endocrinological system, your adrenaline, all your hormones, all makes up this internal part of yourself created by your genetics. But you also have this prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex has got four very important functions that we're going to focus on today. These are some of the basic qualities of that prefrontal cortex, which I'm calling the master brain here. And the first one is being able self-awareness, so being able to be aware of yourself and what is happening in yourself and how you are behaving. Animals don't have that. Your ability to have empathy, so being able to step into somebody else's shoes. Your ability to reflect, for example, on the past, on something that has happened, and your ability to actually control impulses and control some of these things that comes up from your dragon. So if you're hungry, but you're in a lecture, you might not be able to get up immediately to go fetch a cookie, and you'll be able to stay put until the lecture is finished. So I want you to imagine that this prefrontal cortex part of your brain is like this dragon master. It's like the dragon trainer that is actually riding this dragon. And the idea is that this dragon master is supposed to control, steer, guide, and integrate with this dragon. So ideally, your master brain and your survival brain together creates what I'm calling here the sage. So that's a name also meaning a wise person, that wise person in yourself. And this is your best self. When we talk about our authentic selves, these are our authentic selves because you have access to your whole brain, both the master and the dragon, and they are working in unison. But we're going to study this dragon world a little bit because this dragon world has a very strong impact on how we behave. And yet it is us that hopefully should be controlling the dragon. But what happens when we maybe not so engaged with our dragon? And I'm going to go through some of the components of helping you understand a little bit what we all are like when we're in what I'm calling dragon mode. So you can see here in the right top hand corner, we have what I'm calling the street view. And this is a little bit how you look at the world when you're in dragon view. It's like those video games where you can only see what's right in front of you at the moment. You're fighting the baddies, you're finding the treasures, and your priority is survival. And we are quite paranoid and vigilant when we actually in street view mode. So we're much more sensitive and much more focused on what might go wrong. What we don't always realize is that that actually affects completely how you think and how you access your neocortex. So there's a very good book by Daniel Kahneman, for those of you who like reading, who looks specifically at the physiology of bias and how we start thinking when we are in the street view. And he calls this fast or emotional thinking. And this kind of thinking is the kind of thinking we use that is practical if you're in a tight spot. So we make assumptions, we jump to conclusions. If you are under threat, you can't have too much time thinking things through. You've got to make a quick decision. Your thinking's very black and white. And this kind of thinking is very unstable and inconsistent. So this is a powerful way of thinking because this is our go-to thinking. This is where we go to first, but it's not the brightest part of ourselves. And so I like to call this as dragon mode. And dragon is not mode, is not necessarily, it's not, the dragon itself is not a bad thing, a bit like a naughty puppy is not a bad thing. It just is what it is. And it's also the part of ourselves where we have all our fun, where we've got our dopamine reward system. But this dragon only thinks about itself. So it's very self-focused, it's quite proud, but insecure at the same time. And one of the big features of the dragon part of ourselves is what Brene Brown calls emotive judgment. And you all know exactly what I'm talking about if you spend any time on social media. So if you're in dragon mode, feeling a little bit restless, a little bit bored, a little bit stressed, and you're scrolling down, and then you suddenly see a comment that gets your back up, and then the immediate impulse to reply, and to reply with sometimes not even about something we know very much about, and with this extreme judgment. And so this part of ourselves is where you will see aggression. And this is also the part of ourselves that's the most dangerous in terms of injuring somebody else. So there's an amazing book on affective neuroscience that really starts now to plot these emotional states that are created by these different levels. And we now know there are 3 basic states. There might be more, but these 3 are very well described. We understand the neuroendocrine hormones that actually determine them. Don't worry, we're not going to run through that much detail. But there are 3 emotional states that all tells you that currently that dragon is predominant. The first one is what Panksepp calls the panic or grief state. And it's an instinctual state that we all have. We share this with the animals when we are lose connection with something, when we are abandoned, or when we are feeling lonely. And the classic example, for example, is a small baby or a small animal. If the mother was to go off and not come back for a bit, that literally leads to panic in that child if they do not have a caregiver. And if the caregiver doesn't return at all, eventually that child will go into a state of grief, and then eventually into a state of hopelessness. So it's a very powerful, paralyzing emotion one can be in. And when people are depressed, quite often a large part of their neuroendocrine almost gets them stuck within this panic grief state. The second one is fear. And the fear is very much to do with something being unsafe, move away from it. And it can be right to your niggling worries, just worrying about the exam coming up, or to full terror when you're actually under a severe threat. And remember, I mentioned earlier, there's different levels of threat. It could be physical or emotional, or to your freedom of expression. And of course, people who are anxious or struggling with an anxiety disorder will spend a lot of time within this fear state. And then the third one is the rage state. And again, it's when we are not feeling unsafe, but the response is to move to destroy. And one has this, I found this a very powerful description. You have a biological impulse to destroy an obstacle that's in the way. And we actually have a motivation, like a physical motivation, that wants you to break things. So rage by far is probably the most dangerous of these 3 states. And it's a scenario where you can hurt somebody else, or hurt yourself, or hurt objects around you. And you have all seen scenarios, or even been in scenarios, when one gets gripped in that rage state. And of course, this is where aggression lives. So all 3 of these are states that we are in when we are in dragon mode, and we do not have that master that is in control. So how does that link to behavior? And we have to be able to understand that being in these emotional states is very unpleasant. And we do have mechanisms that we use to try and deal with difficult emotions. And I'm going to have to quote dear Yoda here. I don't even know if you people know Star Wars. You might be a little bit before your time. But Yoda said in The Phantom Menace of 1999 that fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. And you can see that road through fear and rage. And what happens is that the dragon does not want to feel stressed, and so it has these very complex patterns of behavior that it develops that reduces stress. And one of the best descriptions I find of these complex patterns of behavior, there's lots of books about them, is that from Shirzad Chamine. And he talks about this extreme unpleasant feeling of anxiety. And then we have these fight, freeze, flight mechanisms that we use to try and actually manage these feelings. So these little habits or patterns of behavior that we have is very useful in physical threats. So if you were in a scenario as a child where somebody was angry at home or dangerous or violent and you went and hid under the bed, that's a very good idea. But if you're now grown up and your partner comes home and you have to sort something out and you go and hide under the bed, that's not going to be very helpful. So some of these behaviors feels logical, but they're actually very, very inefficient. And that's why Shirzad actually calls them saboteurs. They are something that usually makes a situation worse. So when people are behaving badly, or when you yourself notice you are behaving badly, or somebody else is throwing a tantrum or somehow is being very unpleasant, you can be sure that there's a saboteur that's in play, one of these mechanisms. And I'm actually going to run through them. So he describes about 10. I've sort of simplified them to 9 different behaviors. So we had those 3 states of emotion. Remember the panic, the fear, and the rage. And now we're going to look at how do we deal with those emotions. And this is very individual, and it's also depending on the situation. So you might behave very differently to a boss at work than you would to your child at home or to your mom or to a friend. And sometimes you choose to fight, and sometimes you choose to flee, and sometimes you choose to sort of try and negotiate the situation in some way. All of these mechanisms, you can see the master is not in control. And can I just give credit? My child, who's now first year doing fine art at UCT, they did all the drawings here. And in each of these drawings, you can see the master is not in control of the dragon. And so the dragon is taking over. And what the dragon is doing is the dragon is trying to cope with feeling anxious. So the 3 fight mechanisms that we often see, and the most common one that every single one of us do, is criticizing, right? You've had that, right? Things go wrong, do really bad in your exam, you're feeling very freaked out, and then we blame. We blame the varsity, or we blame my colleague friend that kept me awake all night, or we blame alcohol, or we blame government. It's always fun to blame the government. So we have an initial reaction of feeling in control by criticizing someone else. The other thing, and you'll see this a lot in your profs, is that we overanalyze what's happening. Ends up lecturing you about vast amounts of stuff you know. As doctors, we're very vulnerable to this with our patients. So your patient comes in and has not been taking his treatment, and so you give him a long lecture about how he's going to die and all the things that's going to happen, and very clever about all the stuff you know. And of course, all of that is just you actually not feeling busy managing your own anxiety about what's happening, because you know very well that none of that's actually going to help your patient. And then those of us that's very organized, by the way, those things in brackets is actually our strengths that sort of gets turned into these saboteurs. So if you're a very organized person, good with Excel sheets, you might find that you manipulate and try and manipulate a scenario. And you've all had, I think, I don't think you guys do on-call rosters together yet, but when you get to the phase we do on-call rosters with colleagues, and somebody's getting anxious, you will feel how people trying to manipulate everybody else to try and look after their own interests. And you can imagine if you were in a relationship and you are trying to sort something out, if you and your partner is discussing something and you're either criticizing them or overanalyzing them or trying to manipulate them, that conversation is not going to end well. With the freeze mechanisms, and fawn sort of falls under here as well. For those of you who don't like conflict, who don't like fighting, quite often we would please and try to sacrifice our own needs and trying to please the other person and trying to placate the other person without really getting your needs met. Some people actually just become over perfectionistic. So if you're somebody who struggles to hand stuff in because it's not perfect and you haven't got all the I's dotted and the T's crossed. And then a very common one, which doesn't actually achieve anything, but we all love to do, is that 3 o'clock in the morning worry. You know, you wake up and you've got all these thoughts. And of course, the more negative thoughts you are, the more anxious you feel, the more negative thoughts you make. And you have that bargaining as well. Maybe if I do this and maybe if I do that. And this endless worrying does not necessarily solve your problem. And then lastly, sometimes when people are in a scenario where they're feeling anxious, they might just try and avoid that scenario altogether. Maybe there's a person that you're not getting on with and you just try and avoid that person. Maybe there's something at work that day happening that you don't like, so you just don't go to work. Maybe there's a conversation you're supposed to have and you just never bring it up. Also, under the avoiding strategies is just feeling sorry for ourselves. So instead of dealing with the situation, you have long sob stories of how terrible your life is. And then this one, very common. So I think distracting has become, we've now got these lovely little tools in our hands. Candy Crush is a great way to not have to engage with any of the stuff you're supposed to be engaging with. To solve the substance abuse problem. Great, so now we're starting to get a feel for these dragons. I'm hoping you can all imagine, you've all seen these dragons in action, right? In your own lives, in your patients, hopefully not too often in your lecturers. So let's just now balance this all and shows us, well, what is actually possible. So as human beings, we also have this amazing prefrontal cortex. And as I've said, it's not an either or. The sage mode, when you're in your wiser self, is actually about how this master and dragon combines and integrates to become this wise, amazing, authentic being that you can be. And I like to think of that as balcony view. If you can imagine, you can see here down below that you're now able to look out over the whole, over everything that's happening. And then you have the ability to have these higher functions, like being able to have executive function and planning, being able to reflect and have self-awareness, empathy, self-control. Remember, we mentioned those qualities. But now you're able to look at what's happening and you can see things in context and with perspective. You can imagine what happened before. You can see what's going to happen if you behave in a certain way. And your thinking can literally, you're able to slow your thinking down. So if you're trying to solve a maths problem, for example, or if you're trying to study for an exam and you have to memorize a whole lot of information, you need to use that slow thinking part of your brain. And you're going to apply a lot of focus and attention and effort to be able to actually engage that part of your brain. So it's actually very tiring to use this part of ourselves. And this makes it possible for us to interpret information. And this is where we're at our most rational and logical, because we do not have all these emotions coming into the way. So this kind of thing is quite slow. It's not your go-to thinking. You know, it's not the first thing you think. It's what they call second thoughts. It's the thing you think after your first thoughts. But this is also where we are our most intelligent. So when you have a really great insight, when you're having an amazing day and you're meeting with a patient and you're in that sage mode and you're suddenly able to see things and understand things and be able to reflect stuff back, that's very wise. It's that wise part of ourselves. And so the qualities that you can see if somebody has this master, and there's a lovely book by Daniel Kahneman. No, there's another lovely book there in the bottom left, Mindsight by Daniel Siegel, where he talks specifically around this, this ability that we have. He calls it Mindsight, where we're able to become compassionate and tolerant. This is where our conscience lies, where we're able to be humble and generous. And this is where we're at our most creative and innovative. So when you are being really doing amazing stuff, if you love sort of any art or hobbies, things that you do in that mode. If you're doing really good work as a doctor in your consulting room, you're in that mode. And we're able to be flexible and adaptive and in our working circumstances. And remember, I mentioned that emotive judgment of our dragons. Well, now we have the possibility to actually be generous in our assumptions. So when you see somebody posting something on social media, you might stop and think, oh, gosh, maybe they're having a bad day, or maybe they haven't thought that through, or I'm wondering what's actually going on for them. And imagine what a different world we would live in if we were a little bit more generous in the social media sphere. And this is where people are able to be healing and able to be loving. So those really magic moments in your relationship with a child or with a partner or with a parent actually happens when we are in this sage mode. So if we now imagine going through life, the dragon is always active. So in terms of our consciousness, when we drive to work, when we're in our consulting rooms, whatever happens, the dragon's always there, and the dragon is always screening the environment. So everything comes through the limbic system first. All our sense impressions, all our internal body sensations goes through that area. And the dragon is always looking out, are there any threats? Is there anything I need to get away from? Are there any key drives? So if I'm hungry, oh, is there food? I wonder when break's going to be. I'm hungry, hot. Maybe I can go and open the window. So there's always this looking out for our bodily safety. And if everything is safe, then we can go into that sort of neutral mode. When you drive or on your way to class and you can't even remember whether there were traffic lights or not. We have those quick, short, you're brushing your teeth in the morning, getting dressed in the morning. A lot of it, you're just sort of ambling on. But also in this mode, we have access to higher brain function. So if you want to study, this is the mode you want to be in. If you're sitting and studying and your bladder is full or you're hungry, you're going to find your dragon will take you off to the kitchen or to the bathroom. So as soon as there is a threat or there's a drive that gets activated, like that full bladder, you get this little alarm that goes on. And our instinct always first is to either avoid anything that's uncomfortable or to follow the urge. Oh, I'm hungry now. I think I'm going to go and fetch some food. And this little trigger makes suggestions to the master. Oh, hold on, I'm hungry, or hold on, I'm thirsty. And some of this is actually quite subconscious. So you won't even know that you are thirsty until you are standing in the kitchen filling up a glass with water. What needs to happen when these little alarms come, and the way we are designed, is that ideally you get given this little signal, and ideally you as the master decides whether we are going to follow this signal or not, and whether at the moment it has to be fulfilled or whether it can wait. And ideally, we want to live lives where, especially with big decisions, where the master, our prefrontal cortex, is making those decisions and not the dragon. So you can imagine when you're going through your day, you need to ask yourself the question in your life at the moment, who's navigating those consciousness journey? When you are making major decisions about your life, who's driving this? Now, I have to say with you guys, I'm already very confident that you have a lot of sage ability and you have extremely good dragon mastering capabilities, because otherwise there's no ways you would have gotten to fourth year in medical school. So to be able to just complete school, be able to write a matric, be able to even just fill in everything that needs to happen, to be able to get into varsity, to be able to get through every year, to be able to get to your glasses. I think almost the whole class has joined this afternoon's. That's major sage abilities that are coming through. So you have this capability, and it's just a little bit on how we make sure that those masters are the ones that make decisions in the important moments. So when you have this integration and the master's control, then you will find that you have these amazing qualities. And we quite often think about, how do we teach these qualities? How do we become coherent, energized, adaptive, compassionate, reliable, all these qualities that we talk about as amazing clinicians. And the reality is that we don't need to teach you to be compassionate, because you already have all these extraordinary strengths there. You're already able to be reliable and adaptive and compassionate, as long as you are in control of your dragon. And so a lot of, for me, in terms of also working with your patients, is about teaching dragon control rather than giving a person a lecture about they need to be kinder or they need to be nicer, or maybe we should all work nicely together, because you can't preach to the dragon. We'll talk a bit more about that. And eventually, as we grow, it takes a lifetime, and then even then we're not quite there. Somebody who's able to mostly live from this master level in their lives, I would call an emotionally competent adult. So obviously, our dragons is a very important part of who we are, and not all emotions are negative. And we also have these amazing positive emotions. And interestingly, all the pleasure, favorable, positive emotional states, we do have a more integrated sage presence. So I'm going to discuss, and that's going to become important when we talk about sex. I'm going to go through the three major pleasure, favorable emotional states, and then one that is actually quite dragon, but is also pleasure favorable. So a very important one that we need to want to spend a large part of our days in is the care state. So that is the part of ours when we are attached, when we feel love for somebody, when we're bonding with somebody, when we're attached to somebody. It's the part of where we care for ourselves and care for each other. And it's actually hormonally mediated through oxytocin. And when you are, for example, as you know, oxytocin is also made when we care for our infants, for example, or when we're breastfeeding, but also when you're looking after a friend, when you're giving somebody support, when you're caring for somebody, your body also makes oxytocin. And there's different types of ways that care can look like. It can be different, like a living room space, so where you meet with your friends and you chat and give each other support and listen to each other. But it can also be literally caring for somebody's body, making them food, looking after an ill person, for example. So our nurses spend a huge amount of their time in that care space when looking after patients. Another pleasure favorable emotional state is that of play. All young animals have that as well. And this is the fun joy part of who we are. And this is when we do an activity purely for its own sake. Meeting up with friends and playing a game of cards, playing the guitar, doing some art, all those sort of, I would say, almost the things then between care and play that really gives our lives a meaning and joy. And this is often the foundation for friendship, is spending time with somebody else, where if you go out clubbing, or if you're going out dancing, if you're singing together in a choir, if you're going to church together and chatting. So this part of purely enjoying doing things for the sake of doing those things, and usually it is with others around us. The third very positive space is that of seek, also based very much on our sort of primitive instincts, and that is our need to explore, to be curious, and this is the foundation for learning. So much of human endeavor and much of the development that's happened is because people are curious about things and think about things and wonder about things and is keen to find out things and is asking about things. And that's what we're doing today, right? We're in seeking space right now. And you can see with all three of these spaces, we do need to have the sage present, or we can't actually completely engage in this space. So although these are instinctual, old, sort of primitive emotional states, they connect with our higher person, and they sort of create this full experience of being human being. And I think sometimes we don't concentrate on making sure that we make enough time to actually be in these spaces in a day. You can imagine you don't want to spend you want to spend most of your day in one of these three spaces. And you don't want to spend too much of your day in those panic, grief, or rage, or fear spaces. These are four what they call pleasure favorable emotional state, which is that of lust. I think also there is always needs to be some sage present during lust. We'll talk a lot about lust later on. But lust is that emotional part of ourselves that is particularly linked to sexual attraction and arousal and orgasm. And when you're in that space, you find every sensation as erotic. And again, it's part of that part of us that seeks sex. And we don't worry, we're going to talk quite a lot about lust and how it's different in different people, for example. And although when you're in a lust space, usually the sage is quite quiet, but actually to be able to have a valuable sexual relationship, we still want to have some sage presence. If you're in lust state purely only in dragon, and you are not aware of the person you are with, and you are not listening into where the person you are with, then this can potentially become a dangerous space as well. So this is just a very brief graph of what we've just covered. And you can see right at the top here is that beautiful prefrontal cortex of us that has got all these amazing higher qualities. Then we have our neocortex. So, neocortex is where you do the maths and where you do your learning and where you do your remembering and all of those skills that we have in our brain. And that room can either be used under the control of the prefrontal cortex, or sometimes when we're in a fear state, we might use some of these qualities as well. But generally, it belongs to the higher part of our brain. Then we have those three positive emotions. Remember, play, care, and seek. And then subconsciously, we have this dragon emotion, this dragon life that's there all the time. So right at the bottom, you can think of it. I'll talk a little bit about Emily Nagoski. She's written a beautiful book called Come Together, where she talks about the emotional floor plan. And right at the bottom, you have this utility room where your thirst, how much thirst you have, how much energy you have, are you hungry, are your bladder full, all of these kinds of things. And you have these underlying emotions. And the challenge with all of this is that they're quite powerful, but they're subconscious. So we're not always aware that these particular stages, spaces that we are in might be driving our behavior. And we'll talk a bit more about that. So let's start applying this within relationships, and how does this actually now come to be when you're in a relationship with somebody. And I'm going to talk about romantic relationships here because we're talking about sex today, but you can also apply this a little bit to, for example, a friendship relationship. But let's look, you get into a romantic relationship with somebody that you really like. When we first meet somebody, those pleasure favorable emotions rule. And mainly because at this moment, we are still very focused on each other. And so we are very much in that care. Remember, we're hugging, we're holding hands, we're paying attention to each other. That very much puts us in a care space. We're going out to the movies together, we're going out on meals together, we're playing games together, we have dates. So that very much puts us in a play space. We're interested in each other, we learn about each other, we got some interested hobbies that we've discovered we like together. And then, of course, the lust, the sex space may or may not be part of that as well. So when we first get together, we actually always in our best selves because all these positive emotions gets awoken and we are in this sage space. And so what happens when we are in sage space is we pay attention to each other and we affirm each other. And that creates safety. So it becomes like a lovely cycle, you know. So the more somebody pays attention to you, the safer you feel, the more you are in your own sage mode, the more you're able to be empathic and listening and interested in the other person. And so literally when people meet, they meet each other's best selves. You meet sort of the potential of who you are when you are a great person. And as the relationship deepens, hopefully if we develop a love relationship, that love actually consists of these. So love, quite often when we talk about love, we talk about that attachment, oxytocin, emotion of being attached to somebody. But love actually includes these higher sage qualities, which means we admire somebody else and we trust that person. And this is sort of what we would call the honeymoon phase, and where everything feels like it's all going hunky-dory. But then there's something called the price of admission. Oh, I do need to get there's a TED talk on this, and I've just realized I haven't put the man's name in and I can't remember. I'll remember that for the future. It's a very nice TED talk about what he calls the price of admission. And the price of admission in a relationship is what happens is you have that first phase where everything is very nice and hunky-dory. And then at some point, either one or both of the people in that relationship is going to go into dragon mode. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It might be purely their own personal circumstances. Maybe something difficult happens at home. They've got a parent that gets ill. Maybe there's another relationship that's really hard. Maybe they're going through some financial stress. Something horrible happened at work. So all of these things can suddenly make you feel unsafe and you go into dragon mode. You might have a health issue. Maybe you develop a physical illness, or you're going through a phase of depression, or you're struggling with an anxiety disorder. Some people are more sensitive and are more easily overwhelmed by the environment that they're in. So there's and I'm going to call it a superpower, please note, called HSP, highly sensory perceptive. These are people who have the ability to observe much more nuances in their sensations of the world around them. And they can therefore see things that other people do not notice. And this can be on the level of any of the senses, whether it's your hearing or your vision or your touch. It can also be your internal bodily sensations, and it can also be the sensations of picking up somebody else's emotions, for example. So you see, I've mentioned neurodiversity here. So most people who are neurodiverse, well, all people who are neurodiverse are highly sensory perceptive. People with, for example, ADHD, a lot of them are highly sensory perceptive. And I think for me, the important thing with HSP is that this is a superpower and a skill. And unfortunately, we live in a world where quite often you almost do it as an insult. Oh, don't be so sensitive, or he's just oversensitive, you know. And actually, we need to give a little bit of affirmation that actually being that sensitive gives people abilities to see things and notice things that other people might not. And quite often in the if you look in old stories, or if you look in history, your HSPs are usually your advisors, your sages, your wise people within communities, because they are able to pick up so much. The challenge, and if you're not necessarily neurodiverse, about 10 to 20% of the population we think is HSP. I don't have South African data. We just have British data. But I think there's definitely a certain percentage of people who are more sensitive to what happens around them. And the challenge is that although it's a superpower, it's a bit like Superman who can pick up too much. In some scenarios, it can actually be a disability. So if you've got HSP in our world that's so sensory overloaded, you might be able to get overloaded much more easily. You might get flooded much more easily, and you might get emotional and anxious much more easily, which might push you much more easily into a dragon mode. So if you're in a scenario where somebody's shouting or screaming, or there's just too much going on, that person might find themselves in dragon mode. The other thing, of course, that can put you in dragon mode is if your partner is in dragon mode for whatever reason. And there's also triggers. So somebody might have suffered trauma or abuse or neglect, the TNAs, when they were younger, and something might happen in the relationship that triggers particular thoughts and feelings from when they were younger. And quite often it puts them straight into that panic space or fear space or rage space. And of course, what happens in these scenarios is you suddenly reveal what your dragon does when it's not having fun. And that we call the price of admission, because nobody has no dragons. We all have a dragon, and all of our dragons has got these nasty little habits when it's feeling stressed. So you'll all have a dragon moment. We all have dragon days. Sometimes we have dragon weeks. And when we are with somebody that we love and that we trust, we become a little bit lazy to control our dragons. That's maybe a bit negative, but also you can't control your dragon all the time. Maybe you're tired, maybe you're sick. And what happens now is our dragon is trying to control these bad feelings through those bad habits we've mentioned earlier. Remember, they're all there on the top right-hand corner. So now imagine you're in a scenario, your partner's gone into dragon mode for whatever reason, and now they're either lecturing you, or they're advising you, or they're worrying about you, or they're ignoring you but not listening to you. All of those scenarios makes you feel unsafe, and it's going to trigger one of your favorite dragons. And then we get the dragon war. And the simple rule is that a dragon action will usually elicit an even greater dragon reaction. You will have already noticed this in the hospital, in the wards. You will have a scenario where somebody gets upset, loses their temper, says something, and then somebody else suddenly has to reply, and you'll suddenly have these very tense, very difficult conversations. You may have had conversations like this with a friend. You might definitely, when you were a teenager, have had conversations like this with a parent. And usually what happens in that point is not very intelligent. Remember, these are the stupidest parts of ourselves, and we're not usually doing anything that's actually going to resolve the situation. We are just doing something that's going to make us feel less anxious in the moment. Dragons destroy relationships. People quite often have intense philosophies about why their relationship ended and all the different things that contributed to that. But in the end, what happened is that we didn't look after our dragons. So those of you who like to read about relationships, John Gottman is sort of the guru in the world of relationship science. He actually had a lab where they studied couples. The couples would come and stay in this like honeymoon suite. They were only watching them in the living room, kitchen area. There's nothing very too weird going on. And they watched them behave, how they behaved over a period of time. And then they followed them up over 10 or 20 years. And he's been able to identify 4 behaviors that if you see that in a relationship, there's like a 95% chance that that relationship is going to end up in divorce. And there's the 4, and he calls them the 4 horsemen. And you can see, there we go, that's dragon world. So you've got criticism, you've got defensiveness, you've got contempt, and stonewalling is somebody who just stops talking. So from there, just ignore you for 2 or 3 days. So all of these are dragon reactions that's come, and these ones are all rage related, and they are particularly destructive in a relationship. And when you see a scenario like that, if you've got a relationship in front of you or a couple in front of you, and they're describing any of these 4 habits as a regular way and how they're interacting, you can be sure that both partners are under severe stress. And I don't even think it's important to try and figure out where it started or how it started, but they've gotten into a dragon cycle. And the more the one dragon is hurting the other dragon, the more the other dragon is defending and hurting back. And literally what you have sitting in front of you are these 2 poor, pathetic, broken, pained dragons. So now what do we do? So we've got a couple that's come in, they're struggling, they are unhappy, they are not managing. And you need to be able to figure out, are there still what is needed to build a relationship on? And the two big things that I've mentioned earlier, have I mentioned it? No, I haven't mentioned it earlier, is admiration. So do they admire each other? And is there trust? Now, no relationship will be able to be there if there wasn't admiration or trust at some point in the relationship. But usually when people are in dragon mode, they've completely lost faith. They've lost track of that. They no longer see the things that they actually admire about each other. And John Gottman, when he does workshops with married couples, he has found that if you ask people to remember what they admire about each other, when they're in dragon mode, they can't even remember what they admire about each other. They can only see the bad stuff. And he's actually got a list that he gives them with adjectives, that even if that person has it only slightly, to start finding all the adjectives of things that they could admire in somebody else. And so a big part sometimes is to be able to get to sage mode, because only in sage mode are you going to be able again to see what is it that I admire about my partner. Trust, and what we mean by trust, and there's three aspects of trust I just want to briefly mention. The one is emotional accessibility. So if you're in a relationship, you want to know that you can, if you're going through a stressful day, that somebody is there and available for you to be able to talk about whatever's going wrong with your days. And I think probably one of the biggest enemies of emotional accessibility is busyness. So we are just so busy that we can have a relationship where people are like ships passing in the night, and they have different habits, and they're so big that there's actually never an opportunity to just sit down and have a chat. If you are going through something that's emotionally difficult and you do approach your partner, emotional responsiveness means that you can trust your partner is going to listen to you and not going to dismiss you, and it's going to affirm you in what you are bringing. And emotional engagement is a willingness to engage on emotions and to be regularly emotionally engaging with each other on an emotional level, not just on a practical level. So all of these are things that you can see the sage will build. It's the sage part of ourselves that builds these kinds of activities. And if you're in dragon mode, to be able to get to this point, we actually first have to manage the dragons if we want to rebuild admiration and trust in a relationship. So of course, one can't train all of this in 1 hour, but I'm going to give you 3 tools that you can use in your own lives, but that you can also give to patients who are struggling with any kind of dragon stuff. It's not just for relationship issues. And there's 3 things we want to look at. And we're actually we're going to talk a little bit about later about bringing warm, calm curiosity to your problems. But we're going to look at dual awareness. So using our curiosity to become aware of these different states we're in. We're going to talk about, well, how do we get out of dragon mode if we're in dragon mode? And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the superpowers on how do we manage a dragon that's out and about. So the first thing we're looking at is what is called dual awareness, and it's quite an extraordinary human skill. It's only our prefrontal cortex that's able to do that. The animals don't have this skill, although we don't think they have this skill. Our MRIs tell us they don't have this skill. And this is thinking about thinking. So your dog doesn't lie down, according to the scans, and wonder about why he was chasing round and round the horse this morning. The animals just think very much in the present, and their memories is based around present events. Human beings can actually watch themselves think. You can actually think, why did I think that? Or why am I doing this? Or I can't believe I'm just said that, you know, that thing of where you think, oh my goodness, I sound just like my mother. That is you thinking about your own inner experiences. So a base skill that you want to have for all couples, and that actually we all need to train, is training our own self-awareness about our own dragon and which mode we are in. So and it's helpful to look at those different methods in which I mentioned. And now I've got a questionnaire right at the end, a QR code, if you want to go and study your own saboteurs, your own dragon mechanisms, because then you need to be able to recognize, oh, hold on, maybe right now I'm in dragon mode. And so what you want to train the couple sitting in front of you is, if they're having a conversation where it's not going well and things are going sideways, they need to be able to stop and reflect and be able to figure out, hold on, am I in survival mode? Maybe my partner in survival mode. And the simple rule is, you cannot fight fire with fire. You cannot bring your own dragon to the party if the other person is in survival mode. And at that point, you need to be able to call a time out. And just being able to create rules around not engaging when you're in dragon mode already brings down some of the violence and aggression in that relationship. So great. So now you are in dragon mode because your life is crazy and you're stressed and you've got exams and there's just too much going on, and you're feeling very, very stressed, or you're lying awake at night and can't go to sleep. How do you get from that dragon mode and actually get into sage mode so you can start engaging with your best self? And I think the important thing to realize is that when you're in survival mode, that's a physiological reality. It's being created by adrenaline. It's your body that is making you or forcing you into that state. So you cannot think yourself out of dragon mode. You cannot rationalize yourself out of that mode. And so being able to get to that balcony view, you actually have to manage your adrenaline. You have to know how to manage adrenaline. And actually, you guys have been taught this because I assume you've done a little bit around anxiety and panic and all of that. So just to remind us, remember, this is what the stress cycle looks like. If you've got some sort of threat, remember we mentioned there's this different levels of threat. Survival brain is going to kick in. It's going to make adrenaline, and your adrenaline is going to go into fight flight, and your whole body is going to change. Remember, your blood pressure is going to go up, your breathing is going to go up, your shoulders are going to go up, your muscles are going to go tense, and you're going to get ready to fight whatever is causing you a problem. And then you start having all kinds of thoughts. You're vigilantly looking for all the stuff that could potentially go wrong, which makes more threat. And there we go, happily around the circle. So there's two things you can do to try and break the stress cycle. And we know this when we teach people about anxiety. The first thing you do is manage the biofeedback. So the reason why your body is making lots of adrenaline is because your body is letting you know that you're busy fighting. So if your shoulders are sky high and you've got massive tension in your muscles, you're getting a message sent to your brain that you are currently still fighting. So you want to interrupt that feedback cycle, and that's why we teach our patients relaxation techniques. You can go and do exercise, you can go for a massage, but you can have ways to try and relax the physical body. Even taking the warm bath before you go to bed at night is all ways to try and relax the body and send a signal back to your adrenal glands that there's no threat, and please switch off the adrenaline. The other thing you can do is to try and interfere where those thoughts are going round and round, because quite often it's the threat has passed. So maybe you almost had a car accident and taxi, went in front of you, but it's all fine now. You're back on the highway, nothing bad happened. And now you're thinking the whole way, I can't believe he did that. And why Okay, there we go. We lost in May for 2 seconds. That's in dragon mode, but actually this is also true for your own dragon. The only way you're going to manage that dragon to calm down is if you're able to restore some sort of safety. Remember, it's a safety issue. The dragon is feeling under threat. So if you're now trying to lecture that dragon, or trying to criticize the dragon, or trying to please the dragon, or avoiding the dragon, that just makes the dragon angrier. If you can at that moment just focus on calming the dragon down through your own compassion for that dragon, that already restores safety. And so a big part of working with dragons is accepting the dragon. It's like training a puppy. You got to be gracious. You got to be able to affirm that right now you are very angry, or right now you are very panicked, or right now you are very fearful. I can see you struggling, and ignore all the rubbish that they're talking, because the rubbish that they're talking is just the dragon in its own little on its own little wheel. And I think we all need a bit of that when we're having a dragon day. having somebody being gracious and not just call us a bitch or an arsehole or classifying us according to our dragon, but being able to go and hold on, that person's dragon is a little bit out of control today. If you are in sage mode and somebody else is in dragon mode and you are, so all of this you can only do if you yourself or on sale, you can use reflective listening to identify the safety issue and figure out what's actually going on. So reflective listening is when you listen to somebody and then you'll give them a little bit of feedback of what you understand. Look those up. I'll have some back.
Okay, then.
There we go. Hi, Alma. We did notice you left, so we haven't spoken.
Yeah, apologies. The network isn't great. Yeah.
No, that's okay. What I'll do, I'll just pause when I see you stop recording and wait for you to log back on. Okay, good. So we're back online, and we now look at, well, how do we solve problems? Like, how do we solve the internet problem? And when you have a problem, what you want your couple to be able to do is to turn towards that problem with three main qualities. You want them to be able to be calm, which is that master observational point of view. We want them to bring care. Remember that emotion of care and connection. And so we want to bring warmth to that. And we want to bring curiosity. So instead of the partners sitting together and just criticizing each other's dragons, which is what we normally do, we want to be able to sit down and look at these dragons and go, well, this is what my dragon does. And when your dragon does this, this is how my dragon responds. And my goodness, these dragons are making such a mess of our relationship. How are we going to sort this out and working together as a couple? Dragons are never going to solve relationships. Only sages can do that. Sometimes you'll have a couple that's able to reach this way of working together and with a little bit of understanding can actually do this kind of work. You have to be able to identify a couple that is so stuck in dragon mode that they're not going to reach this space. And those are the couples who need therapy. They need a third person to help them deal with all those difficult dragons. And in the end, a safe dragon is a happy dragon. So if we want to look after our own dragons and look after other people's dragons, we need to be able to create safe spaces for them to thrive.